Have you ever walked into a place, and even though you had all the right papers, the right appointment, the right credentials, you were still told to please wait a moment? Not because you were late, not because they were too busy, but because, in their eyes, you just didn't look like someone worth prioritizing. Today's story isn't about a lawsuit. It's not about shouting or protests. It's about a quiet woman who sat for nearly 2 hours in a bank lobby and then stood up and made the entire system of power sit down and take a long look at itself. If you've ever felt invisible because of how you look, where you're from, or what they assumed about you, stay, because this story is for you. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to update our latest videos. Late afternoon in Atlanta. The sun blazed down on the stone-paved sidewalk in front of the gleaming glass and steel headquarters of Wellington Federal Bank. Cars drifted slowly past, while inside those thick panes of glass, another world, cold, quiet, and filled with invisible power, was preparing for a woman they never expected to face. Danielle Morgan, the Black CEO of Morgan Advisory Group, stepped out of a sleek black sedan with resolute poise. A caramel-tailored blazer, matte black heels, and her natural curls neatly pinned back. Every detail spoke of a businesswoman who had walked through boardrooms, signed million-dollar deals, and been underestimated, solely because of her skin color. The glass doors slid open with a soft beep. No one greeted her, no personalized nameplate, no assistant waiting. Only Tessa Brighton, the blonde receptionist with a high bun, nude lipstick, and eyes that swept Danielle from head to toe, then stopped as if scanning a file labeled "Does not meet criteria." "Hello, do you have an appointment?" Polite enough, but not warm, like verifying a delivery, not welcoming a top-tier partner. "I'm Danielle Morgan. I have a meeting with Mr. Stephen Caldwell at 11 a.m. Tessa glanced at the screen. A brief pause, then a slight nod. "Your name is on the list. Please have a seat. Mr. Caldwell will see you as soon as he's available." As soon as he's available. A phrase Danielle had heard too many times before and always understood what it really meant. She nodded silently, set her handbag down on a leather bench in the corner of the lobby, where sunlight spilled through a 3-story-high window, casting shadows across the grey stone floor as if to expose the coldness woven into this space. Everyone who passed by got a closer glance than she did. Every smile Tessa gave the next person was brighter than the mechanical nod she gave Danielle. And Danielle, someone who had signed contracts with C-suite executives, knew the truth. The door here wasn't closed, but it wasn't truly open either, at least not for people like her. Each minute passed like a slow drop into a still pond. And right in that moment, when a white man walked in just minutes after her and was immediately ushered inside without an appointment, Danielle knew. She hadn't been forgotten, she was being politely set aside. And in that moment, something inside her began to rise. Time dripped by like cold coffee, and Danielle Morgan, the only black woman in the marble-tiled waiting lounge of Wellington Federal Bank, was still seated in the middle of a world not built for her. Glossy brown leather chairs, dark wood-paneled walls, designer potted plants arranged according to perfect feng shui. But all that luxury was nothing more than a gold-plated shell masking a colder truth. This place wasn't designed to welcome people like her, only to tolerate them. 11:10 a.m. No one called her name, no updates. Tessa Brighton, the receptionist in a light-toned suit with eyes trained to appear polite, yet vacant, kept her gaze locked on the screen. Every time a new guest walked in, mostly white, fashionably dressed, Tessa's smile would bloom like she'd just reunited with a cherished old friend. And Danielle, just a name on the list. 11:30 a.m. She adjusted the strap on her watch. 30 minutes had passed, but it felt like 3 hours. Each time heels clicked across the stone floor, she lifted her head in hope, only to see yet another guest escorted straight into the VIP area, greeted with sweet warmth from Tessa or a soft chuckle from Andrew Price, the male employee behind the service desk. No one asked if she needed anything. No one made eye contact twice. She was present, but treated as invisible. 11:45 a.m. A blonde woman entered, designer dress and Chanel bag in hand. Charlotte Sterling. No ID check, no explanation needed. Within 20 seconds, Ethan Reyes, a staff member, appeared and whisked her inside, like a royal guest being ushered through a palace gate. Danielle watched, no longer surprised. She only tightened her grip on the handle of her bag, the soft leather pressing into her palm, reminding her of one thing. She didn't come here for favors. She came for respect, the same respect afforded to anyone else. But respect in this building came with a color, a look, a code. 12 p.m. 1 full hour had passed. She tore her gaze from the watch and slowly looked around. The lobby still gleamed like a showroom. Crystal chandeliers, walnut reception counters, employees dressed as if they had just stepped off a summit stage. But at the center of it all sat something that didn't match the decor. A black woman, silent, upright, eyes sharp as glass. The chair she sat on, black leather, was no longer just furniture. It was a statement. She didn't stand, she didn't leave, she didn't cause a scene. But she also didn't lower her gaze. If they thought she would sit quietly long enough to disappear on her own, they had picked the wrong woman. 12:07 p.m. The glass doors slid open once again, slowly, with elegance, almost as if they too knew they were meant to serve the right kind of people. Charlotte Sterling stepped in, her blonde hair softly curled, her Louboutin heels gliding across the marble floor as if they never truly touched it. In her hand, a pristine cream Chanel bag, flawless, as if lifted straight from a high-end boutique display. She didn't have to speak. Every gaze in the lobby followed her, Tessa's included. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling." Tessa Brighton nearly shot to her feet, her smile so dazzling it could outshine the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Ethan is expecting you in the VIP suite. Please head right in." No name check, no appointment verification, no sign-in required. Just knowing nods from everyone around, as if it were obvious. If you're one of the chosen, you don't wait. Danielle Morgan, seated just 3 steps away, kept her hands resting neatly on her lap, her eyes fixed and unblinking, not out of envy, but because she needed this third confirmation. This wasn't coincidence. This was the rule. She had already watched a middle-aged white man be invited in within 2 minutes of arriving. Then came a young, golden-haired couple, led inside by Ethan Reyes as soon as they signed in. Now Charlotte Sterling, who didn't even have to sign anything. 12:12 p.m. Behind the teller desk, Andrew Price chuckled and said to a colleague just loudly enough for Danielle to hear, "Feels like we've got a VIP line." And then the rest. A ripple of small laughter followed. No one said her name, but she knew exactly who they meant. 12:15 p.m. Danielle turned her head toward the reception desk. Tessa Brighton didn't look up, still busy with her screen, even though she'd just ushered Charlotte Sterling in not 5 minutes earlier. And in that precise moment, Danielle understood. She hadn't been forgotten. She had been overlooked. Not because she was late, not because she missed an appointment, not because of any error, but simply because she wasn't one of the chosen. In this system, power didn't lie in the protocols. It lived in the first glance, in who was trusted, who was doubted, who was welcomed, and who was told to just wait a moment. Danielle stared straight at the door leading to the executive offices. No expression, no fury, just one sentence forming clearly in her mind. If you won't call my name, then I'll walk in myself. 12:23 p.m. Time no longer flowed. It dragged minute by minute, as if testing the limits of patience itself. Danielle Morgan tightened her grip on the leather strap of her bag and stood up. The leather seat let out a cold, dry creak, the only sound to break the frozen silence of the Wellington Federal Bank lobby. She walked slowly but deliberately toward the reception desk. Each step was like a soft knock on the door of a system, not asking to be let in, but reminding it that she had never been erased from this space. Tessa Brighton looked up, still the same mechanical smile, the same vacant stare. "Is there something else I can help you with, ma'am?" Danielle held her gaze. She didn't lower her voice, didn't soften her stance. "I just want to confirm, has Mr. Stephen Caldwell been informed that I've been waiting since 11 o'clock? Tessa tapped a few keys, barely glancing at the screen, then shrugged. "He's still in a meeting. It may take a little more time. Someone will come get you." A little more time. Danielle tilted her head slightly. There was no anger in her face, only a tension in the air pulled tight like a wire. The atmosphere between them shifted. Then those individuals without appointments, who were seen immediately. What was the reason? Tessa gave a tight-lipped smile. "We follow internal directives. It's not my place to discuss." Not her place, but an insult to me. Danielle said nothing more. She gave a slight nod, like someone who had just heard a verdict read aloud. Then she turned. But she did not return to her seat. She did not return to the invisible zone they had silently constructed for her. She walked straight toward the hallway leading to the executive suites, where the branch directors worked, where VIP meetings took place, and where real power sat behind closed doors. Tessa jumped up from behind the counter, her voice rising, laced with panic and frustration. "Ma'am, you're not allowed in there. That's a restricted area." Danielle didn't turn back. She walked tall and steady, passing through the frosted glass doors like slicing through the veil that separated clients from authority. The entire lobby froze. A few customers turned their heads. Andrew Price paused mid-keystroke. Ethan Reyes quietly set a folder down. Danielle stopped in front of the door that read, "Stephen Caldwell, Branch Director." She knocked 3 times, sharp, firm, unapologetic. She didn't wait for permission. Then she opened the door herself. Inside, Stephen Caldwell, salt and pepper hair, dark grey suit, half-rimmed glasses, looked up with irritation, still on a call. "Give me a moment," he muttered into the phone, then immediately hung up when he saw her. Danielle shut the door behind her. She stood tall, facing the man who had made her wait nearly 2 hours. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chilled air like a gunshot. "I'm Danielle Morgan. I arrived on time. I have all the required documentation, but I had to walk in myself. Because your system never intended to call my name." And in that moment, for the first time that day, Stephen Caldwell found himself without a single word to say. Inside the director's office, lined with rich walnut paneling and bathed in warm, ambient lighting, Stephen Caldwell looked like a man being pulled out of a reality where he had always written the rules. But today, the genuine leather chair behind his desk was no longer a fortress. It had become a witness stand. Danielle Morgan didn't sit. She stood above him, not by height, but by the stance of someone who refused to be diminished. Stephen cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. I apologize, Ms. Morgan. We've been unusually swamped today. A number of unscheduled clients, some urgent matters from headquarters. I understand the inconvenience you've experienced, but don't apologize unless you intend to change something. Danielle cut him off. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it sliced with the precision of a scalpel. I arrived on time. I had a confirmed appointment. I submitted my paperwork 3 days in advance. And yet I sat outside for nearly 2 hours, while others who arrived after me, no ID, no check-in, were ushered in immediately. Stephen blinked, then attempted a well-rehearsed bureaucratic smile. I understand how you feel, but in certain special cases… Special cases? Danielle tilted her head. I am the CEO of a financial advisory firm managing over $200 million in active assets. I have credentials. I have a top-tier credit rating. I have letters of recommendation from 3 major investment boards. But apparently, there's one thing I don't have. The skin tone your system prioritizes. Silence. Not polite silence, but a silence pulled tight like wire. Stephen clenched his hands, his eyes flicking toward the door as if searching for an escape. But the only exit was facing the truth. You're misunderstanding, he said, his voice dry. Our reception procedures are non-discriminatory. There may have been a procedural hiccup. Not a hiccup, a choice. Danielle didn't blink. And that choice is repeated every single day in this building. With people like me. She pulled out her phone, turned on the camera, not to record, but to place it gently on the desk. A symbol, a quiet warning. Words today would no longer vanish into the air. Stephen looked at the phone as if it were a live grenade. He sat up straighter, tried to steady his tone. I assure you, if any unfairness occurred, I will personally review. I don't need a review. Danielle stepped forward and placed a file folder on his desk. I need you to look the truth in the face. And I'm going to say it, right here, right now, whether you want to hear it or not. 3 knocks at the door. Stephen's head lifted, relief flashing across his face like a drowning man spotting a life preserver. Must be my assistant. But the person who entered wasn't an assistant. It was Jonathan Whitmore, National CEO of Wellington Federal Bank, flanked by 2 members of the Executive Council, Mr. Grant and Mr. Holloway. Danielle didn't turn around. She stood tall, hand resting firmly on the folder. She didn't need anyone to rescue her. But their arrival twisted the entire board. In a game Stephen never had time to prepare for. For one brief second, Stephen Caldwell still thought he could control the situation, like he always had. But the moment the door opened and Jonathan Whitmore stepped in, flanked by 2 members of the Executive Council, the entire atmosphere shifted. No advance notice, no assistant clearing the way, only Jonathan's piercing gaze, the kind that commanded respect across the entire Wellington banking empire. Danielle Morgan. Jonathan paused, visibly surprised. I didn't expect to find you at this branch. Not a single greeting from the branch director, not even a glance in Stephen's direction. Jonathan walked straight over and shook Danielle's hand, with both of his. A gesture that radiated respect and sincerity for all to witness. Stephen froze, his face drained of color. The excuses he'd been mentally preparing crumbled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore," Danielle replied calmly, as if she had anticipated this moment all along. "I arrived on time for an appointment confirmed a week ago." Jonathan glanced at his watch, then turned to Stephen. "So, how long has Ms. Morgan been waiting, Stephen?" Stephen cleared his throat, forcing a sentence that wouldn't sound catastrophic. "There's been a bit of confusion, sir. Today's been unusually—" "I've been waiting for 1 hour and 45 minutes, Danielle interrupted. Her voice wasn't raised, but every word landed like a nail driven into the polished wood desk. "And in that time, I watched at least 5 walk-in clients, with no appointments, escorted into the VIP suite ahead of me." Jonathan said nothing. He turned toward the 2 executive council members. Mr. Grant furrowed his brow. Mr. Holloway began scribbling notes in a leather-bound notebook. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Stephen, step outside," Jonathan said, his voice low but unquestionable. "I'll speak with Ms. Morgan. As for you, we'll talk later." Stephen stood motionless for a few seconds. Then he lowered his head, quickly gathered his papers, and exited the room like a soldier who had just been demoted. The door shut behind him, a sound that landed like the lid closing on the career of an arrogant man. Jonathan took the seat across from Danielle, his hands clasped together, his eyes steady. "I want to hear everything, no details left out." Danielle nodded. She reached for her folder and opened it. "But not to talk about finance. I'll tell you, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been told to please wait a moment and never heard their name called again." Outside the door that had just closed, Stephen Caldwell leaned against the wall, his jaw twitching, ears burning with every word spoken inside the very meeting room he once believed he commanded. But now he was nothing more than a discarded piece on the board, in a castle he once thought was untouchable. Inside, Danielle Morgan began to speak, not with tremors or evasion, but with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime swallowing injustice. "This morning I arrived on time. My appointment had been confirmed since Monday, but the receptionist, Ms. Tessa Brighton, simply told me to wait, without notifying anyone. So I waited. 15 minutes, then 30, and then an hour and a half. The 2 members of the Executive Council sat still. Each word Danielle uttered felt like a blow to the polished facade Wellington Bank had so carefully crafted over the years. I watched at least 5 people escorted inside, no appointment required. Every single one of them was white. One woman, Charlotte Sterling, was addressed as Mrs. Sterling the moment she stepped in, and was taken directly to the VIP lounge. Meanwhile, I, a CEO of a financial firm, was treated like an inconvenience. Jonathan Whitmore leaned back slightly. His face stiffened when he heard the name Sterling. He knew her, the daughter of a major shareholder. But that didn't justify what Wellington had done. Danielle pulled out a small slip of paper from her folder. "This is a note I wrote while waiting. A teller named Andrew Price, standing behind the reception desk, joked with a colleague, 'Some clients matter, others just fill up the lobby.' They didn't know I heard them." Mr. Holloway shifted in his seat. Mr. Grant looked up directly at Jonathan. In that moment, everyone in the room realized this was no longer a personal grievance. This was an indictment of a culture of discrimination. Jonathan gave a slight nod. "Ms. Morgan, do you have anything else?" Danielle didn't answer immediately. She looked at him for a moment, then opened her laptop. On the screen was a discreet recording from her personal camera, capturing the full scene in the waiting area. Tessa Brighton's icy demeanor, other guests being warmly greeted, and most damning of all, the moment Charlotte Sterling walked straight through the lobby without so much as an identity check. I didn't come here to record anyone, but I've learned, if you don't document it, no one believes you. And if you stay silent, no one remembers. Jonathan closed his eyes for a beat. When he opened them again, he no longer looked like a CEO running an empire, but a man forced to face the truth that the system he built had rotted from the roots. I understand, he said quietly, and I won't let this be buried. The warm amber light caught the shoulders of Jonathan's deep navy suit. But inside that suit, the usual prideful confidence was gone. All that remained was the resolve of a man ready to expose all the other suits who had been using protocol to cloak their prejudice. The meeting room was silent. Each second seemed to stretch in the stillness. Beneath the warm glow of amber lights, across the walnut conference table, and in the realization that an entire system of power was, for the first time, being forced to hear testimony from someone it had always viewed as marginal. Jonathan Whitmore sat upright, hands resting lightly on the table. In front of him was Danielle Morgan's open laptop still playing the footage. No music, no editing, just raw footage, unpolished and undeniable, enough to make any person with a conscience flinch. On screen, Tessa Brighton looked up, face unreadable, eyes categorizing. Charlotte Sterling entered and was led straight into the VIP lounge by Ethan Reyes. Andrew Price chuckled to a colleague, "Some guests are just here to make the lobby look upscale." Danielle sat quietly in the far corner, her eyes tracking everything. A moment that needed no narration to pass judgment. Jonathan closed the laptop with a gentle snap. The click was soft, but in that moment it sounded like a gavel striking down a verdict. He looked up at Danielle. There was no apology. Instead, he turned to the two executive council members, Mr. Grant and Mr. Holloway. His voice was low, firm, and allowed no room for debate. We didn't do enough. Not just wrong at this branch. We were wrong in pretending this kind of thing doesn't exist. No one replied, but no one objected. Both men looked down at Danielle's folder, the one that had sat untouched on the table for nearly 2 hours that morning, unseen and uncalled. Jonathan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a pen. The same kind he used to sign billion-dollar deals. But this time, it wasn't for a contract. It was to restore the recognition that had been denied for far too long. He picked up Danielle's file. No more questions, no referral to the credit division, no need for the risk assessment team, no committee, only justice. He signed his name. A swift, clean signature, so firm it made the pen click audibly as it finished at the bottom of the page. Jonathan slid the file back toward Danielle. Your loan is approved, not because you spoke up today, not because you brought evidence, but because you've always deserved it. It's just that our system lacked the courage to see it. Danielle didn't smile. She didn't nod in gratitude. She looked him directly in the eye, as an equal. Then tell me, how many others like me were turned away? How many didn't have proof? How many left this place in silence and never came back? Jonathan was silent. For the first time all day, his face showed regret. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened. His hands laced together, as if trying to stop himself from offering excuses. More than I've ever had the courage to admit, he answered. He turned toward Grant and Holloway, then back to Danielle. We're not just going to fix one file, we're going to start fixing the entire system. And in that moment, there was no longer a distinction between who sat at the head of the table. Danielle Morgan, once asked to wait a moment, was now making an entire institution rise and face a truth it had long chosen to ignore. Danielle gently closed the file that had just been approved. No smile, no nod of thanks. She looked directly at Jonathan Whitmore, not with gratitude, but with the clear gaze of someone speaking as an equal. If I hadn't walked in on my own today, what would have happened to this file? Jonathan remained silent, not because he lacked an answer, but because saying it aloud would indict the very system he led. Danielle didn't wait. It would have been forgotten, not due to a technical glitch, not for lack of documentation, but because I wasn't the right kind. A heavy silence filled the room. Mr. Grant looked down at the polished wood table as though he had just seen the reflection of all the mistakes he'd once ignored. Mr. Holloway straightened in his chair, set down his pen, and for the first time looked at Danielle not as someone to judge, but as someone to listen to. Danielle continued, her voice steady and clear. I didn't come here seeking an exception. I came to remind you that there are hundreds of files like mine and thousands of people like me dismissed before ever being considered. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, fingers interlocked on the table. This time, when he spoke, there was no defensiveness, only sincerity. The problem isn't just at the front desk. It lies in how we've built a system that appears fair, but lets bias seep into every threshold. He stood, turning to the two council members. We can't just fix one individual. We have to change the entire structure. Mr. Holloway spoke, his first words of the meeting, then let her help us rewrite it. All eyes turned toward Danielle. Jonathan nodded slowly. I agree. No one understands this silent discrimination more than someone who's had to break it. And in that moment, it wasn't just a door to one office that opened. It was a door within the system itself. Shifting at last, from the inside. That afternoon, an emergency meeting was called at the headquarters of Wellington Federal Bank. A rare occurrence without a media scandal or legal crisis erupting from the outside. But this time, the tremor came from within, from a client with a valid appointment, and from truths that could no longer be denied. In the oval-shaped boardroom paneled in dark ebony, normally reserved for discussions of profit margins and market strategies, Jonathan Whitmore stood before the full executive council and senior advisors. He brought no slides, no charts, only a file with a slightly bent corner, bearing a single name, Danielle Morgan. This morning, one of our most promising financial partners was left waiting for nearly 2 hours, simply because she didn't look like the kind of person this system unconsciously prioritizes. And this wasn't the first incident. This isn't an accident. This is a system. Chairs shifted quietly. Some council members began to realize this meeting wasn't for listening. It was for deciding. Jonathan turned and signaled the support team to activate the main display. On screen appeared a bold proposal to immediately reform the client intake and evaluation protocols across all Wellington branches. The document's title, Equal Access Protocol, a fair interface for every client. I'm proposing the formation of an independent reform committee, reporting directly to me. And I want Danielle Morgan to serve as honorary lead advisor to that group. No objections were raised, no budget questions, no challenges to his authority, because everyone had seen the footage. Everyone had heard Danielle's account, calm, measured, void of outrage, but painful in its undeniable logic. Mr. Grant, silent until now, was the first to speak. She doesn't need us to give her a seat. She's already earned it, with the truth. Mr. Holloway nodded, then turned to Jonathan. Starting tomorrow, every internal policy update must also be shared with Ms. Morgan's advisory group. And I recommend that every branch director be required to study this incident file as a mandatory case review. The air in the room no longer carried the atmosphere of routine leadership. It now held the gravity of a machine, realizing it had been blind in its own spotlight. An extra chair was added at the head of the table, not to fill a vacancy, but to make space for someone the system had long chosen to overlook. And from that moment on, the decision wasn't passed by majority vote, but by awakening. The news spread faster than any press release. Just one day after the Executive Council meeting, the entire Wellington Federal Bank network received an urgent email from headquarters. The immediate launch of an internal investigation at the Atlanta branch. Soon after, a memo was issued, its title short but seismic. Temporary suspension of the Atlanta branch director and front-of-house team involved in the Danielle Morgan incident. The first name on the document, Stephen Caldwell. The second, Tessa Brighton. There was no more room to conceal, no language left to excuse internal procedures or isolated errors. They weren't reassigned. They weren't placed on paid leave. They were suspended pending investigation for violations of professional ethics and discriminatory conduct. Inside the bank, the tension was palpable. Stephen, once praised for record credit growth, had his name scrubbed from the internal portal overnight. Tessa, once the face of VIP hospitality, no longer stood behind the front desk. No farewell, no explanation. And then the unexpected happened. Within 48 hours of Danielle leaving the Wellington building, she received over 60 emails from bank employees across the U.S. Most were from lower-level staff, people without a voice, without the power to push back. I was once told to take the long way around when walking in a black client. Thank you for saying out loud what we only ever whispered, never dared to write down. I've watched people get rejected just because they didn't wear designer clothes, and I'm ashamed I stayed silent. Some sent internal recordings, some requested anonymity, but all were saying the same thing. What happened in Atlanta wasn't an exception, it was a system. Danielle didn't reply to every message, but she read them all, every line, every word, every trace of suffocated truth in the voices of those who had endured too long without standing up. And within Wellington, Jonathan Whitmore signed off on escalating the matter to an independent audit board. And for the first time in the bank's history, every branch director was required to attend mandatory retraining on equity and implicit bias. Stephen Caldwell and Tessa Brighton were once the ones who guarded the gates. Now they were living proof that if the gates only open for a chosen few, it's the gatekeepers who will be called out first. Danielle Morgan didn't answer the press. She didn't appear on morning talk shows. She didn't stand beside the CEO in one of those all-too-familiar reconciliation photo ops. Instead, she quietly returned to her office at Morgan Advisory Group, a serene space atop a high-rise in Midtown Atlanta, its glass walls overlooking a city she had once fought just to be seen as equal within. 3 days after the incident, Danielle published a single post on her company's website. No clickbait title, no hashtags, no illustrative images, just a simple headline. Justice doesn't need celebration, it needs to be done. In fewer than 800 words, she offered no recounting of grievances, no personal attacks. Not once did she mention Stephen Caldwell by name. Instead, she wrote about the first time her mother, a retired nurse, was left waiting 3 hours in a clinic lobby, simply because she wore flip-flops and carried a canvas bag. about her first Asian American colleague who was denied a bank loan despite a flawless financial record. She wrote, "I don't need to be thanked. I need to be seen, the way everyone else deserves to be. And I didn't stand up to become a symbol. I stood up because I was tired of waiting for change from the same people who keep saying, 'We're trying.'" Within 24 hours, the post was shared more than 300,000 times. Outlets from Bloomberg to The Atlantic quoted it. One standout headline from Business Insider the following morning read, "Waiting room justice, delayed justice is denied justice." But it was the comment section beneath Danielle's post where the real wave began. "I'm a receptionist at a small bank. Starting today, I won't let anyone be overlooked just because of how they look. I waited 2 hours at the Wellington branch in Dallas. They never called my name. Today I know I wasn't the only one." Danielle Morgan didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for all of us. And so, from a single story, one that could have been buried like thousands of others, a movement began to take shape. Not from political declarations, not from a marketing campaign. It came from one person who had once been asked to "please wait a moment," and decided not to wait anymore. 2 weeks later, inside a grand hall at Wellington Federal Bank's headquarters in New York, an unusual event took place. Not a shareholder meeting, not the launch of a new financial product, but a press conference of apology. Jonathan Whitmore, the national CEO, stepped up to the podium. A spotlight fixed squarely on him. No branded backdrop, no moderator guiding the event, just a single microphone and a silence waiting to be broken. "Today, I do not stand here as a representative of Wellington's success. I stand here as a representative of a system's failure, one I allowed to persist for far too long." In the audience below, journalists, internal staff, and representatives from civil rights organizations remained absolutely still. Danielle Morgan, a client, a leader, and a respected black woman, was overlooked, delayed, and rendered invisible by the very bank I oversee. Not due to a single mistake, but because of an entire culture. And as of today, I make this commitment. No one should ever have to walk in alone again because their name wasn't called. The cameras panned slowly to Danielle, seated in the second row, composed, not taking notes, not smiling, just listening, as if measuring the true weight of each word spoken. Then came the concrete steps. Jonathan announced 3 specific actions. All Wellington branches nationwide would implement the Equitable Client Initiative, a mandatory retraining program focused on unconscious bias, inclusive reception, and transparent handling of internal complaints. Danielle Morgan's loan file, not only approved, but now designated as an official case study in the bank's training curriculum. How to misjudge a client and what it costs. All client complaints involving discrimination would now be sent directly to an independent audit panel, beyond the influence of local branch directors. As the press conference came to an end, a few attendees stirred as if preparing to applaud. But Danielle did not move, and they understood. This was not a moment to celebrate, because this recognition should have come long ago. And for Danielle, being seen was never a reward. It was, and always had been, a basic right. After the historic press conference, it wasn't a speech, it wasn't a policy announcement, but a single moment that financial and civil rights publications alike chose as the headline image of the day. The photo of Jonathan Whitmore stepping down from the podium, walking straight to the second row, and extending his hand to Danielle Morgan. It wasn't a ceremonial handshake. It wasn't between a CEO and a client. It was between a man who had led the system and a woman that very system had deliberately overlooked. The handshake lasted exactly 4 seconds, but for those who had ever been asked to wait because they were different, for those denied without explanation, for those who had stood at the counter but were never looked in the eye, those 4 seconds were confirmation. They weren't imagining things, they weren't alone, and they deserved more than what the system had once assigned them. "Ms. Morgan," Jonathan said quietly, just under the range of the camera's microphones, "thank you for forcing me to see what I ignored for far too long." Danielle didn't say thank you. She simply nodded, small but steady. "I don't need praise," she replied. "I need a promise." Jonathan held her hand 1 second longer. "I promise no one else will be kept in line because of bias, and no one else will have to speak up alone again." In that moment, the tailored suits and stage lights were no longer the backdrop of a PR event. They became witnesses to a promise that would ripple across tens of thousands of lives in the years to come. One handshake, seemingly small, but for people like Danielle Morgan, it was what they had been denied their whole lives: recognition. At the right time, in the right place, from the right person. The Atlanta sun was still blazing, just like that morning. But as Danielle Morgan pushed open the tall glass doors of the Wellington Federal Bank headquarters and stepped outside, everything had changed. Not for her, not for the bank, and certainly not for those who would come after her. No more scanning eyes judging her from head to toe. No more glances that slid past as if she didn't exist. No more being asked to just wait a moment. A few employees stood at a distance inside the lobby, quietly bowing their heads in greeting. Not because of her title, but because they knew exactly what she had just done. She had forced an entire system to look in the mirror. Danielle didn't look back. No photos, no selfies, no tears. Only steady footsteps, her handbag over one shoulder and her spine just as straight as it had been the moment she walked in. A young staffer rushed through the front door, nearly bumping into her. He recognized her, stepped aside quickly, and whispered almost instinctively, "Thank you." Danielle nodded. She didn't know who he was, but she knew what he represented. A generation no longer willing to be invisible. A black sedan waited at the curb. The driver opened the door, but Danielle paused for just a beat. She turned to glance back at the building, not with resentment, but with a silent message. "I came in alone, but I'm leaving for more than just myself." She stepped into the car, the door closed behind her, and inside the lobby she had just walked out of, the people who once kept their heads down were starting to lift them, starting to ask questions, starting to understand. That from this day forward, anyone who walked through those doors would no longer be asked to wait because they were different. They would be welcomed because they were human. Danielle Morgan didn't walk into Wellington Federal Bank to become a symbol. She simply wanted to be respected, as any human being deserves to be. But when the door refused to open for her, she didn't break it down. She walked through it, with calm, with truth, and with the quiet resolve of someone who had waited far too long to be heard. She didn't demand privilege. She didn't ask for special treatment. She asked one question: why is it that, despite having the qualifications, the credentials, I'm still treated as if I don't exist? And that question, lonely as it may have sounded, shook an entire system. Today she didn't just reclaim dignity for herself, she cleared a path for everyone who had ever been told to just wait a moment, to be called first on the list. Danielle's story is a reminder to all of us that justice doesn't come from privilege. It begins with one person who refuses to stay silent. If you've ever been dismissed, ever been overlooked, ever been left in the waiting room simply because you didn't look the part, then this story is for you. Share this video, not to talk about Danielle Morgan, but to remind the world. Every movement begins when one person dares to cross the invisible line.